Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Bonsoir et bienvenue. My name is Riley Brockington, and I'm the City Councillor for River Ward and an Ottawa Public Library Board trustee. It is my pleasure to welcome you this evening. Kwe Kakina. We believe it is important to acknowledge that even as we gather virtually, we are on the unceded and ancestral territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin First Nations people. Nous rendons hommage à toutes les Premières Nations, les Inuits et les Métis, leurs aînés, leurs ancêtres, et nous soulignons leur importante contribution passée et présente. Thank you to our partner in this event tonight, the Ottawa International Writers Festival. Tonight, we welcome best-selling author Terry Fallis to discuss his latest book, his long-awaited comic spy story, Operation Angus. Before we begin, I do want to take this opportunity to invite you to join us next Friday, September 10th at 3:30 p.m. for our first Afro-Caribbean dance workshop with Susan Richards as part of our Dance Fridays. Then on September 13th, we have our next Writers Fest event, a conversation with author Ashley Bristow about her memoir, My Own Blood. Remember, you can always visit the OPL website to find out about upcoming programs and to access the wide range of content and resources that comes with your library card. It is now my pleasure to introduce Sean Wilson from the Ottawa International Writers Festival to say a few words. Thank you and have a good evening. Merci et bonsoir.
Thank you, Councillor. Good evening, everyone. I'm also broadcasting from the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you all to the first live event of the 2021 fall season and to thank our friends at the Ottawa Public Library for their ongoing support. I also want to thank you for supporting authors and booksellers through these difficult times. Our official bookseller is Perfect Books on Elgin Street, but I know that wherever you are right now, there's an independent bookseller nearby who would be more than happy to sell you some great books. The festival is supported by generous individuals like you, so I hope you'll consider subscribing to our newsletter and making a donation to support our ongoing programming and children's literacy initiatives. I want to thank the Government of Canada, the Government of Ontario, the City of Ottawa, the Ontario Arts Council, the Canada Council for the Arts, Carleton University, CBC, and the Ottawa Public Library for their ongoing support. 2 entire seasons of literary programming are available online right now. It's all free and on demand at writersfestival.org. Plus, now that we're moving out of summer, we've got new episodes of the podcast each Friday afternoon. And as of next week, we'll be presenting at least 2 live events per week. So between the podcast, our live events with the library, and our other live events in the next month, we'll be hosting the following authors: Melanie Challenger, George Elliott Clark, Ann Shin, Clayton Thomas Mueller, Ashley Bristow, Guy Vanderhaeg, Elizabeth de Mariafi, Kathleen Winter, Jesse Wente, Wayne Johnson, Jody Wilson-Raybould, Zoe Whittall, Alison McLeod, Mona Awad, Katerina Vermette, and Kamal Al-Soleil. So there's lots of great writing to look forward to. Plus, given that we're all fans of fiction here tonight, I guess there's also that federal election coming up. So there's lots to look forward to on September 20th as well. If you enjoy this event or any of our virtual programming, please consider making a charitable donation. Our host tonight is a longtime friend and collaborator. You can hear him weekdays from 3 to 6 p.m. on CBC Radio 1, where he hosts All in a Day, a show universally acclaimed for his world-renowned book panel the first Monday of each month. Let's give a warm virtual welcome to our host this evening, CBC's Alan Neal.
Yes, just to clarify, Sean Wilson is one half of that panel, just in case anyone wonders why it's so critically acclaimed. I am here in the upper levels of CBC, in case you're thinking my decorating at home needs work. And I am a radio guy, so this is not my usual medium. I was originally quite concerned about my beard for this online event because I don't see a lot of guests face to face anymore. Our show is usually this abandoned studio and all the guests are on the phone. So my beard, over the course of the pandemic has got a bit unwieldy, but then I realized if there was ever an event where it would be appropriate to have an unkempt beard, it would be one where you're talking about Terry Fallis's character, Angus McClintock. I mean, he's probably the only hero who gets a sentence devoted in the most recent book, for instance, to a hunk of cheddar cheese hanging lodged in his beard just southwest of his all too active mouth, is the way Paulus puts it. And so I've checked for cheese and I think I'm okay. But Angus also in this book does things I'm never going to do, scouring a controversial building for bombs at one point, getting out of a trunk of a car he's been forced into at gunpoint, taking off after a plane at the Rockcliffe Flying Club, smashing into it with a car. He's setting a very high standard for MPs in terms of taking action, is what I'm going to say. Like in the next federal election, when they're on your doorstep, ask, would you chase a plane for me in a car at the Rockcliffe Flying Club? These are also all somewhat unusual actions for Angus himself. I have to say, anybody who's been a fan of Angus McClintock since he was first brought to our attention back in 2008, he's not always into this dramatic cloak and dagger behavior, but so it's also a shift for Daniel Addison, his assistant, who in this book finds himself saying, I checked my cell phone where I'd created a to-do list. Call Fitz was number 1. I'd already crossed it off. Busy, good for me. Number 2 on my list, find Chechen's sleeper cell. That might take me a little bit longer. So I don't know if it's the next phase of Terry Fallis's action hero career, perhaps, but the guy who won the Stephen Leacock Memorial Medal for humor twice so far, I'm going to say so far, Terry Fallis joins us now by Zoom. Hello there.
Alan, what a tour de force you were. That was amazing.
Oh,
So great
yeah,
to be with you.
You just wrote a book, but my intro,
Oh, it was great.
That's
Loved
what's
it.
winning the awards, Terry.
It was terrific.
I, as a kid who grew up on the Rockcliffe base, I was intrigued to see that a key scene happens at the Rockcliffe Flying Club. And I did want to know your accuracy detail here when it came time to figuring out, you don't have to give away, we don't want to give away exactly all that happens in the scene, but were you spacing out what would be allowed to happen on that airstrip?
I was, Alan, to a certain extent, perhaps not as much in that scene as I did in others, but I was making use of Google Earth and looking at the top-down view to make sure things would work. But if there are members of the Rockcliffe Flying Club reading the book, I encourage them to be not quite as discerning when they read that scene.
Does that plague you at all when you're writing? For instance, just that idea of, oh gosh, is that really what's going to happen with the car? Would there be enough room in this space in particular? Because you could have, made completely fake locations, right? You could have claimed down at made up Rockcliffe altogether, changed the names altogether. But you've chosen real spaces, whether it's Mama Teresa's or Chapel Street or the Rockcliffe Flying Club. How important is it to you to get the space right?
It's quite important. I think it's those little details, particularly if you live in Ottawa, it's those little details that make the novel feel real, because it helps readers, even if they don't live in Ottawa, it helps them visualize the story. Those little details bring it to life a little more. I mean, I could write it just as easily without saying it was Chapel Street. I could just say, turn down this side street. But it gives it a presence, a sense of location that, so I think those details are important. And I always try to bring them in. Even things about, hotel lobbies or restaurants or, and even if they're made up locations, I mean, I use a senior citizens home, seniors residence in Cumberland, that is made up, but I have been in so many seniors homes as my aging grandparents originally, and eventually my parents, that I hope I wrote those scenes with some believability, some authenticity, even though there may not be one in that particular location in Cumberland.
And were you always a details guy when it came to writing? Like, were you always somebody who, I don't want to say obsessed, but was it always important to you to be getting those details, or was that something that developed over time?
No, I think it was, I'm an engineer by academic training, and I think details sort of embedded in an engineer's personality, that we care about the details, because details can make a big difference when you're engineering something. So when I'm engineering a novel, I kind of feel the same way. So I do worry about the details, and I try to get them right. I mean, I think back to the first novel, The Best Laid Plans. I remember having coffee with Camille Montpetit, who was a former clerk of the House of Commons. And I wanted to meet with him to make sure I had the parliamentary procedure down so that nobody could read the novel and say, that couldn't happen. And we sort of worked together to create a scenario that protected the procedural integrity of the House of Commons. Yeah, I think that's important because it can undermine a reader's faith or confidence in the story if there are flagrant errors that haven't been caught.
So then my next question, which I'm somewhat hesitant to ask then, given the bomb subplot to this, Terry, how much experience did you have, therefore, figuring out where bombs could be planted? And again, not giving it away, but there is a building that where the characters are needing, for instance, to hunt for some explosives, and you seem to have a lot of detail about how that would be done. And I didn't know whether this was just a hobby interest of yours, or is this something that you had to do some research into?
That's right. I was mixing up a batch of C4 in our basement.
Yeah, could happen.
No, I think the amount of detail there, you probably could glean from watching a few MacGyver reruns, but so it may not be fully solid. But you try to add enough detail and legitimacy to it to ensure the credibility, the believability of the story. So that was fun. I had fun with that. Actually, I am not. You may not know this, but I do not have a background in explosives. So it was one of those things we had to do a little bit of research on.
I mean, in terms of the spy nature of it, though, there is. We talked a little bit about this on the radio show I host, All in a Day, heard 3 to 6 on 91.5 FM in Ottawa, and people can listen to that interview at cbc.ca/allinaday. But we were talking about the character of Vivian in this book, who is an ex-CSIS agent, who's kind of the guide for Angus and Daniel once they become embroiled in a spy's the spy element of the story. Did you have a Vivian, though? I mean, was there a guide for you taking you into that world at all?
Well, it is funny that you should say that. Shortly before I started mapping out the novel in earnest, I got an email from a guy named, I hope he doesn't mind me telling his name, Phil Gursky, who lives in Russell, Ontario. And he said he was going to be in Toronto and he's working on a book and wanted to pick my brain about a few things. And he happened to mention that he was a 30-year career CSIS operative. And I accepted his invitation very quickly, as you might imagine. And I hope that I gave him the benefit of whatever wisdom I might have, which is probably not very much, on his issues. But then we spent some time talking about the new novel I was writing, and he was very helpful. To be honest, I don't know that the title of the novel, Operation Angus, would be that title without that meeting I had with Phil Gursky, not to mention some other elements in the story. So that was very helpful. So we only chatted that once, but it really set me on the right course, I think, and allowed me to move forward where I was a little bit at sea before that. So I am grateful to him, and if he's watching, I want him to know I just mailed off his copy of the book this afternoon.
That was his thank you. The one book. That's what he gets.
Well,
He's
in the
his
acknowledgments
story
as well.
into this, and just. By the way, if Phil Gursky is among the 139 participants currently on the screen, and anybody wants to add anything to the conversation, they can do so. The Facebook comments, they will then transfer them. If you've got a question, there's be the Q&A as well, where you can ask it then, but we can integrate it throughout the conversation as well. So feel free, if you're getting really bored of my questions, feel free to ask some of your own, and I will choose whether to accept them or not. No, but please feel free to do that as well. The explosives that we mention in this book, though, it sort of revolves around a building that's being built in Ottawa. And while this is completely unrealistic, that there would be a building that's been designed that anyone in Ottawa has a problem with. In this completely fictional version of Ottawa, there are protesters and people who share their lack of approval for something that's been designed. This is the Samuel de Champlain Center that is being designed in the area that used to be where the Astrolab was for longtime residents of Ottawa. And the design, because it goes a little bit wrong, ends up looking like long spider legs that are kind of climbing up the side of the cliff. I'm describing this much worse than Terry Falls does in his book. But the thing that immediately came to mind was the reaction that people have had to the various designs of the Chateau Laurier expansion here in Ottawa, and the designs for that. But were there particular moments from the past of people being angry about design that were coming to mind for you when you were inspired to write that subplot?
Well, nothing really in particular, but I know there are many instances of the public getting up in arms about the design of buildings, particularly buildings where there is government funding involved, that it's sort of considered to be public architecture. I think that's actually kind of a realm, public architecture.
Yeah.
So in this case, the building is actually quite beautiful until they learn that the cliff into which it is embedded, cantilevered out over the Ottawa River, is not holding it as firmly as their initial testing suggested it would. So they need to take some remedial action. I mean, they could tear the building down and start from scratch. That was an option, but they decided to save money and to put these supporting legs above and below that make this building that was a beautiful glass maple leaf. If you look down from above, it now looks like a spider crawling along the side of the cliff. So it makes some citizens of Ottawa and the greater Ottawa area very unhappy, and they take to the streets. So I did have some fun with that. I mean, protests is just a part of Ottawa's culture. Usually it's on Parliament Hill, but they don't have to go too far to protest at Nepean Point, which is just across the street in a way.
They have inspired chants as well. With originally it starts, "Hey, hey, ho, ho, that spider's got to go," but eventually they get to kill the spider, kill the spider, right. Which I have to give you credit for. I think that would have been quite catchy. I know I could picture CBC crews out to film the exactly. People yelling, "Kill the spider, kill the spider," in all likelihood. Now, is Terry Falls a take to the streets kind of person? Like when you're annoyed about architecture or public issues, do you always watch your step and say, "Oh, I'm not going to comment on that"? Or does it end up in this? Like, is that what ends up happening? You're angry about it, and so it ends up cloaked in a book in some way.
Well, having cut my teeth in the national student movement in my university days, I was heavily involved with student politics, somehow got myself elected president of the students union at McMaster. And so I spent an extra year or so at McMaster earning my engineering degree. But I was involved in the student movement and organized and pounded the pavement in many a march for a whole broad range of issues. I was also, many years later, living in Toronto, I was chair of the board of Planned Parenthood on the board for 6 years, and we would march in the Women's Day parade all the time. And I'm happy to say that my wife and I marched in the anti-Trump women's parade that happened to be in the new year after his ascension, shall we say. And that was quite an inspiring day. So I have been known to carry the odd banner, though not, I wouldn't be a hardcore protester, but I have done my share of marching. And the thing to say, as I always say about marching is actually very easy. You just put one foot in front of the other and you go, and it makes you feel very virtuous. The hard part is actually affecting real change on whatever those issues might be. And that takes more of a day-to-day effort and changing the way we actually live our lives. But the marching is great to sort of take a break and to commune with the others who are part of the collective voice.
It's funny because I wasn't sure how much you end up channeling that same spirit into the writing. Like when you're really upset about something, do the first drafts of the books often have a lot more, I want to say vitriol, but the stuff that's making you upset, do you ever temper it over time in a draft of a book?
Yeah, I mean, I usually am concerned about something or writing about something in my novels, even though those issues are cloaked in a funny story and characters you might come to like. But I mean, those first two novels were my love letters to democracy. It was my venting my concern with the state of democracy and how we practice politics in this country, even though it's how I earned my living in the early parts of my career. So yeah, you do find yourself toning it down, if only in the interest of supporting the story and keeping the reader with you. Sometimes if you're too forward with your point of view, it gets in the way of the story. So for me, it's the primacy of story. But if I can send a message, even one that is beneath the surface, I always like to do that. So you can read the novel on a couple of different levels often.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because one of the themes that I was kind of interested with in the story is that the reason that Angus and Daniel get so involved in this case in particular is because there are individuals throughout the government chain who are not being listened to. There are operatives whose advice isn't being heeded. There is research that's being ignored. There are reports that aren't being read or being taken seriously. And while I know it's all done in this sort of, fun, frothy way in the book, frothy sounded more derogatory than I meant, but this fun, go with fun way, there is that issue hanging over a lot of what we're currently dealing with in a lot of different ways from politicians now. The question of, are people are listening to the people who have done the work up until now? And I didn't know if I was reading in too much into it, or whether that was something that troubled you or bothered you.
Yeah, absolutely it does. And when the substance of a report that is overwhelming, the evidence is clear, and it is decided that will be ignored because there are other interests at play, often political interests. Yeah, I'm concerned about that. Public policy is a very important part of our life as Canadians, and our civil servants who are doing the work are extraordinarily talented. We have one of the best civil services in the world. So I'm always concerned when the work done by civil servants that is balanced and thoughtful and progressive and enlightened and provides a clear path that is in the national interest, then is shoved to the side for reasons that are usually free of substance. they are more political. And even, the other issue, Alan, that in the book, the other reason that Angus and Daniel are acting alone in this is because of a petty feud between two cabinet ministers, where the cabinet minister in charge of public safety, in charge of CSIS and the RCMP, really hates Angus. And remember from the previous novels, you will know why. And that's another terrible thing that happens, where politics gets in the way of making the right choices. And so I'm hoping people will pick up on that and realize that, feel free to dislike somebody, but when it gets in the way of the national interest or public safety, you got to draw the line somewhere there.
I just want to assure people that this is a concern that Terry Fallis has had for a long time, because I tried to find the earliest mention I could of Terry in the media. And I take you to a 1984 edition of the Globe and Mail, where a 24-year-old Terry Fallis, it says, a coalition of opponents to John Turner's Liberal leadership campaign claims a large group of Ontario youth delegates who support Mr. Turner were picked on the basis of essays they submitted to a Turner-dominated selection committee. The unusual system of selecting 29 delegates to the Liberal leadership convention by means of brief typewritten essays, was used last weekend in Toronto. And to have already committed delegates picking delegates they knew by their name and preference of candidate is outrageous, says Terry Fallis, chairman of Mr. Chrétien's Ontario Youth Campaign. So we just want to say this idea of tampering, of not listening to the facts, it was happening earlier. Was a 24-year-old Terry Fallis writing fiction at that point?
Uh, well,
I mean, not the kind of
about to
fiction that
say-
we're talking about in those
Right.
letters that were being written, but
I was about to say emphatically no, but when I think back, when I worked in Ottawa on Parliament Hill, it was 1984, and I did write a couple of short stories, purely recreationally, never sent anywhere, just wrote them longhand. Well, it was long before the personal computer was with us, so I guess I actually did, but it was more. It wasn't a calling yet. Then it wasn't something that I longed to do. I just enjoyed writing and enjoyed storytelling, but in the next 20 years, I think I wrote maybe 4 or 5 short stories, and none of them had even a scintilla of humor in them. They were
what were
serious.
they?
Well, there were 2 with very strong feminist themes that I wrote. There was one about set in Ottawa, again in Parliament Hill, but in a different time. Laurier was involved, but they were very earnest and serious. And I simply hadn't found my voice as a writer. But I enjoyed doing it, and I just sort of kept them in a drawer somewhere. I think I probably still have them somewhere, but literally just a handful, 4 or 5 stories. And then I decided to write something when I was 45 years old, which is when I wrote
But
the
kept them
plans.
in a drawer. Why were they in the drawer? Were you nervous about showing them to people?
I think so. And frankly, I hadn't gone to the trouble of typing them out. I didn't have a typewriter, or we didn't have computers then. So I just had these, this sheets with foolscap with my rather bad handwriting on it. So they were just sort of practicing for me. but the seeds may have been sown back then.
So this could be a collection in the future. The early works. This could be published
I doubt it.
at some point. I did wonder though, because obviously some of when you're observing or commenting on the political situations, it's drawing, of course, in your experience working in politics. But do you recognize the humor of situations when you're in it, or does it always require some period of time to look back on something to see the humor? Like, for instance, when I read that John Turner Chrétien thing of the outrage over the youth delegate not being chosen for the typewritten letters that had been sent, it sounds funny now. I'm sure it didn't seem funny to you then, or did it seem? You don't have to comment on the John Chrétien situation, but in terms of the absurdity of it, do you get the humor of things when you're in the middle of them?
Well, I can tell you at the age of 24, I did not see the humor in that at the time. I was so wrapped up in that. It was my first full-time job out of university. I turned my back on my engineering career and gone into politics. And I loved it. I had a great time, at least for the most part. But somebody once said, I think comedy is just tragedy plus time.
Sure.
And I may have paraphrased it, but it's something like that. So I think aging a little bit and having a better perspective on things also helps identify the humor. Plus, I've learned that to me, humor can be a very trenchant instrument of social comment. Humor can be a different entry point for people to get engaged in an issue. So when I wrote those first 2 novels, I did want people to laugh and enjoy the story and enjoy the characters, but I also wanted them to think about how we practice politics in this country, and perhaps having them laugh along the way would make it easier, and almost by stealth get them to think about issues that underlie the fun. Actually, I can tell you where that idea of humor as a social change agent, when it dawned on me. I won't drag out the story, but it was in 1985. I was working on Parliament, and I somehow got the good fortune of being the sole Canadian delegate to a conference in Strasbourg, France, the International Federation of Liberal and Radical Youth. Actually, that's the organization, or IFLRI. You may know it by its acronym, IFLRI. But this was a conference on racism and xenophobia, and there were delegates, 1 delegate from Canada, 2 from the US, and the rest, maybe 40, from Europe. And the speaker was the main speaker was a guy named Donald Woods, who was the editor of a South African daily newspaper, who befriended Stephen Biko. And he wrote a great book, which I have, which I won't be, oh, look at that. Look at that. There it is.
I swear we didn't plan this. I swear
did
I
not
didn't
plan
tell him
this.
ahead of time where I was going with this question. Okay.
I'm
all right.
stunned when I turned around that I actually laid my eyes on the book. But Stephen Biko was, of course, the founder of the Black Consciousness movement in South Africa, and was arrested by the police and imprisoned and eventually beaten to death. And just to, not to drag out the story, but Donald Woods very courageously ran a front page editorial decrying this crime and called Stephen Biko a hero for a nation. And he was summarily banned from the country, had to dye his hair black, dress a priest, and escape across a raging river into Lesotho. Some of you may be familiar with the story if you saw the movie Cry Freedom with Denzel Washington and Kevin Kline. Kevin Kline played Donald. This was before the movie. And Donald Woods was telling us, it was a conference about racism, and he was telling us about the apartheid regime. And 5 minutes after he started talking, everyone in the room was laughing, killing themselves laughing. And I remember holding my stomach and saying, I can't laugh about apartheid. And I felt horrible, but he was so funny, pointing out how ludicrous and utterly ridiculous the passbook laws were that were the backbone of the apartheid regime. And eventually he helped us understand that we weren't laughing about apartheid, we were laughing at apartheid. And when you laugh at something, it's classic satire. You laugh at something, you weaken it. It's just not a common entry point to the issue, but it was ridicule. And it finally dawned on me that humor can, if wielded skillfully, and one day maybe I'll get there, but you can use it as a way to mobilize people and empower them and engage them in an issue. Because rage, the usual staple of such social movements, has sort of, by repetition, it loses its effect. How often, Alan, have you walked across Parliament Hill and okay, this is the 2 o'clock protest. I see signs, I'm not sure what it is. And it just washes over us after a while. So humor is a different approach that might be able to mobilize more people. End of the sermon, sorry.
No, but I mean, that's an interesting example though, because in the book, you're dealing, for instance, with a Russian president who bears striking resemblance to a real Russian president. But I mean, the issues that they're talking about how the yielding of power, not yielding of power, not yielding of power, in fact,
Yeah, exactly.
the wielding of power, and the Chechen subplot that's involved there as well. Very serious, real things. And I wondered, when you were writing, was there ever a point where you're like, am I taking this too late? It doesn't come. It's not a criticism. Yeah. I'm asking, like, are there moments where you take a step back and think, am I dealing with this in a not serious enough light?
Yeah, I think that's a sound observation. I was a little concerned about it, but I hope when you read the story, I mean, I'm concerned about Russia's interventions in other former East Bloc countries that are looking for self-determination and independence, like Chechnya. And there were two very bloody wars in Chechnya as they were put down by Russia. And of course, the other theme is that Russia has been active in other countries, assassinating former citizens through the use of poison. And so those are all very real things that happen. So I hope that when they read the story, they will see that in a way, I support the Chechen cause. Obviously, I don't support what the Chechen sleeper cell was trying to do on Canadian soil. But there is a certain sympathy for their position. But yeah, it was not lost on me. And I was, when you write a thriller, the stakes are high, it has to be serious. So how do you balance that with humor? And a few thriller novels have done that. People might have read Robert Ludlum's The Road to Gandolfo, which is it's quite a funny thriller. Or even, I think I actually have it here. Oh yeah, Hugh Laurie wrote a book
I'm
called
gonna
The
wait till you just keep
Gunseller.
grabbing books
Well,
from different parts of this alleged
Yeah.
room that you're in. It's actually just staged props
Yeah,
that you
that's
have
right.
ready
No.
to.
No, I realized I just put it there earlier in the day, but Hugh Laurie, who is a very funny British actor who teamed up, best friends with Stephen Fry, but he starred as House in that TV series. But he wrote this rather funny thriller novel called The Gunseller. So I was taking my cues from some other writers and seeing whether or not, as a challenge to me as a writer, can you walk that line that separates the typical thriller territory with humor and still make it work? And I have no idea whether I have. I'm sure others will tell me that probably in the next few weeks, but that's what I'm trying to do.
Yeah, it struck me that one of the ways that you twist the thriller idea, or the spy thriller idea, I should say, is by the casting of the characters too, because not only, I mean, we were talking about it during the radio interview, the idea of these very unglamorous cars that you use, which is sort of the opposite of what we normally, nothing against people with Ford Tauruses. They're wonderful cars. It's just, as pointed out in the book, not necessarily the stuff you'd normally picture in the spy novel. But even the characters who are assisting, you've got Vivian, this senior citizen ex-CSIS agent, who is not sort of the typical guide that would have been in the story, somebody who's dealing with arthritis and so on,
Right.
who's not necessarily going to normally be the central role in a spy novel. She's an amazing character. I loved her being in this. The character named Newton, who shows up to help with the Vivian, there's this fantastic description of Newton when she shows up, and this is their surveillance expert, where it says she arrived on a bike. It was a small bike, likely designed for adolescent, but it was too big for her, and she'd added blocks of wood to the pedals so she could reach them. Behind her bike, she pulled a two-wheel trailer of sorts, presumably bearing her equipment. She wore a bike helmet that rode down low and almost covered her eyes. It would have fit Andre the Giant's gargantuan head with room to spare. She stood thin and sinewy and all of about 4'11", wearing green cargo pants, a black t-shirt, and gray fleece tied around her waist, with tiny little hiking shoes on her feet. Like that image stayed with me, by the way, the image of Newton arriving.
Good.
I wondered though, like, that's the perfect example where you could have gone anywhere with that, the character. Are you casting all the time in your mind, thinking, okay, no, this would be funnier if the person was just not who they were anticipating?
Yes, you're playing against type, and you're shattering some of the stereotypes that you often find in spy novels, and yet demonstrating that even though they don't look like the traditional person in that image, they are talented and get their work done well and help solve the case and serve the cause in the end. So yeah, I am always playing with stereotypes. I mean, Daniel is the only one who isn't really against type. He is not necessarily that unusual as a political, backroom boy on the Hill, because most of them are boys. Angus is not your usual MP. Muriel and Evelyn, they're all a bit different, and I have fun with that. And that's part of how you find humor, is you go against type. And
the characters emerge sort of fully formed, like when Newton showed up in your mind. Because every writer is different, right? And some people, they work and they craft and they think, okay, I'm going to add the glasses, or I'm going to add, there's something that needs to be become, I need to know the backstory. And sometimes characters walk onto a scene, almost surprising the author. I wondered, does that happen to you? Does Newton just bike into the scene?
Newton, in a way, did. And there are two aspects of it. There's her physical appearance, and then there's her personality and how she speaks.
Sure.
So you mess with both of those. And it takes a little bit longer maybe for the voice to come. You play with the voice a little bit, and you modify some sentences to exaggerate something or to downplay something else, until you think you've hit a sweet spot. And of course, everyone's sweet spot is in a different place. So yeah. It's only a sweet spot for me, but I hope it happens to connect with readers. But yeah, you're right. The characters, it's hard to explain, because I don't feel like I spend a ton of time plotting them or planning them or developing them, it's kind of like the first thing that comes into my head. There are a few little tweaks, and there it is. So I don't know how that happens, and I try not to mess with it. I just sort of embrace it and accept it. But I mean, Angus was. I sort of thought of him in a very short span of time, and he hasn't really changed very much.
Was the
So
beard there right from the get-go? Did you know
oh
the
yeah,
beard? Okay.
yeah, the beard, and the hair, over which he has virtually no control, nor does he care, frankly.
Right.
So, and part of it is that as a comic novelist, you're looking for areas where humor can be added to the story. And physical appearance is one of them. If he were just a normal guy, I'd be losing a whole arsenal of humor potential in that.
It's interesting because I was thinking about how Angus would fare during the pandemic, and how the different characters would fare. This was written during the pandemic, but it's set directly after the more or less 3 months, I think, after the last novel that we'd seen the characters in.
Right.
But it struck me there were so many things where there was the scene where you're describing Lindsay's quiet little acts that mean so much to Daniel, where she's talking about her holding his hand and draping an arm across his shoulders, walking beside him with a finger hooked through one of the belt loops, physically linking us. And it struck me there were all these little moments in the book where it was almost like this love letter to the times of being able to be close to people in a public event and being able to touch. And there's a scene which I won't give away where they're very close and not socially distanced at all, Angus and Daniel, and not that they wanted to be. But Kayla has written asking, how did the pandemic lockdown impact your writing process? Did you find it had an effect on what ended up coming out in the book?
I think, Alan, it did have an effect, and a positive effect. Normally, I squeeze my writing in around a day job where I still work 4 days a week, so I can afford to be a Canadian novelist on the 5th day. But in the pandemic, I was no longer walking to the office each day and back. We've actually shut down our office, and I now work out of this room. So my writing seems very much closer to me because I'm actually in the room where I write when I'm doing my day job now.
Right.
But also the pandemic meant that the events like the Ottawa International Writers Festival or readings at the public library that I would do across our city, our province, and sometimes the country when I'm lucky, those were all canceled or switched to virtual events. So I all of a sudden, and I usually do about 100 events a year. So when they sort of fell by the wayside, all of a sudden I had found time, and I had more time to write, and longer periods of time, longer stretches of time within which to write. And I find that's helpful to me. I'm not good when I got half an hour, I'm going to write something. I mean, no, I need like 6 hours stretched out in front of me if I'm working on the manuscript. I can work in shorter stints if I'm plotting and planning and mapping out the story, because I'm an engineer after all, so I'm a heavy outliner. So yeah, the pandemic, it had, I hate to say that there might be a positive effect of the pandemic, because really it's been a tragedy from stem to stern. But it did keep me in this room for longer stretches of time and allowed me to really focus on the novel in my off days and weekends in a more concentrated way. So I think I stayed in the story longer, and that was helpful.
Thanks for the question there, Kayla. That idea of engineering as well, it struck me that there's a section where they're on a hovercraft once again in this book, and there was McMaster did a little bio of you at one point where it said, as a child he went about designing and building a hovercraft, but when he arrived at McMaster in 1978 his love of machines was left behind in the face of student politics. But I somehow didn't realize that you'd actually designed hovercrafts yourself. So when Angus is running and creating this hovercraft, this is from personal experience, like you know what it takes to run one.
Yeah, I think the only way you could read that first novel and take in the far too much detail about the hovercraft is because I designed that hovercraft. Now that one was never built, but the one that's in the novel is one that I designed recreationally at while I was studying engineering. But when I was 15, a classmate and I did design and build a full-sized hovercraft, 12 feet long, 6 feet wide, a lift engine and a thrust engine. And I have a photograph of it on my blog, I think, somewhere at the Ontario Science Centre, where it was stored for a while. So I come by my interest in hovercrafts honestly from having built one when I was just a kid. Before I was old enough to drive, I could drive a hovercraft in the Science Centre parking lot.
So when Angus is teaching Daniel about hump speed in a
Absolutely.
hovercraft sense, that this is something you already knew. You had this in your mind.
Yeah, there was no research required for any of the hovercraft esoterica that comes out in the novel.
You don't lecture people though the way Angus is, right? Like when Angus gets going on something, this is not part of a Terry Fallis personality trait, is it, for you to spout off on all you know?
No, I don't do that because I see it as not a great trait in others. But Angus is sort of a born teacher, so I think he's trying to do it he's coming from an honorable
Yes.
position. He wants Daniel to learn and to satisfy his curiosity about this. And Daniel, of course, just doesn't want to get wet in the hovercraft.
Question from anonymous attendee, if that is your real name, from Facebook. Was it pure coincidence that the book came out just in time for a federal election? And this commenter loved the first two books and the TV series. Did you have inside track that this would be the best time to release your novel, that Trudeau was going to call the election?
Well, I had to call in a lot of favors at the Prime Minister's office to get them to call the election now, tracking with the release of my novel. No, for some reason I've had, it's just been complete serendipity, the luck that is associated with timing of elections. I think in my second novel, maybe my first novel, but the date that I chose for the election ended up being the next federal election date. And the coincidences mounted till I wondered whether I was actually causing political events in the country just by thinking them. But no, it was just a pure fluke, and not one that I'm unhappy about, but yeah, complete fluke.
Janet McEwen also wrote in saying, might there be a TV production of this book? I was a background performer in the TV production of The Best Laid Plans, which was a wonderful quality production. This certainly is a visual, there's no problem seeing the cinematic elements of Operation Angus. Did you have that in mind when writing in the back?
Well, and Janet, thank you for your service on the production. That's great, and for the question. I think when I'm writing a novel, I actually do play it out visually in my mind's eye, and I think that helps my writing. So I try to think quite visually. So I can see that whole thing, all the aspects of the story playing out. And will it become a TV series or a film? Boy, I sure hope so. That would be great and some fun. And I guess we'll just wait and see. I've been really lucky in the past with the one mini series based on the first book in this. Mm-hmm. I don't want to call it a series, but in this group of 3 books. I've had a couple others optioned, and one came very, very close, but as is usually the case, it just fell short at the 11th hour. But who knows? I think it would be fun to see this brought to the small or the large screen. So we'll see. Fingers crossed.
It does feel like Angus, the ongoing series, could work. Just saying.
Well, you're sitting in the right building to
let me just
promote
use
that
my
idea.
Incredible contacts to make that happen for you, Terry. Yeah, they listen to me all the time. But that idea of these characters that are so near and dear to so many people. Do you ever see a possibility of making bad things happen to them? And I don't mean comic bad things like the mishaps that they happen, but you're dealing with an aging Muriel, in theory Angus as well. I almost did feel like as we were tracing him through the letters to his wife who's passed away, I was thinking, okay, is he like aiming himself towards joining her at some point? You've dealt with grief. I mean, when we talked about Up and Down, your book where somebody's struggling to even fathom or deal with the grief going on in their life, then could you lay Angus to rest? Like, could you kill off Angus?
Well, it's a really good question. The prospect frightens me a little bit, but I think it is possible. I mean, there is often a thread of sadness that runs through certainly most of my other novels, and in this one, and in The Best Laid Plans on the High Road. That sadness really comes in those diary entries when Angus is writing to his departed wife. I actually thought I might, one option to write a prequel. I kind of wouldn't mind writing the love story between Angus and Maren Lee.
Yeah. Okay. All right.
And that's as far as I've thought about it. There's nothing to report on that, but it's just an idea. But I mean, life is like that. We laugh and then we cry. And sometimes the crying is more intense because we have come from laughter. And sometimes the laughter is more intense because we've come from the depths of despair. So it just depends where you put the laughter and the humor. John Irving, who is one of my literary heroes, by reading his books, I often say that John Irving is my mentor. He doesn't know that, but I think of him as my mentor because I learned a great deal from reading his novels, particularly the idea of juxtaposing humor and pathos, and sometimes rubbing them right up against one another to make both sentiments more powerful. So it's possible. I mean, Muriel is not young, and who knows? I don't even know if there will be another Angus book in the future. But she's had a good run and is now living with Parkinson's, as did my grandmother. That scene where Muriel is walking or not walking, she is kind of stuck and her legs are just vibrating. And the way she gets moving is that Daniel recognizes what's happening, immediately lies down on the ground right in front of her. And when she sees him lying on the ground, she just vaults over him and high steps into the building. And that is not fiction. That is what I used to do for my grandmother. When she needed to step over something to get herself moving. Parkinson's is not a pleasant disease. So anyway, so there's lots of pieces of me that sort of get inserted in there, again, to add little flashes of authenticity and detail. But so, yeah, who knows? I think it's possible that it would be hard because I'm so fond of these characters.
I'm still going to make another pitch for the Muriel, Vivian, Landon combination, three older women,
Cool.
sort of like a Charlie's Angels of a
Charlie's
different generation.
Angels.
Exactly. That's Angus's angel. No, probably doesn't work.
Charlie's ants.
Maybe. Melanie Coyle writing in to say, will there be a fourth adventure for Angus and Daniel? Just speaking of this, but she's saying, I suggest Angus rebuild the Alexandra Bridge since it needs to happen in the real world. So
yeah, that's right.
Of course,
that's
in,
right.
in your universe, it fell apart. So they do have to fix it.
Well, thank you for the question, Melanie. I didn't have any plans to bring Angus back. I thought when I finished The High Road that I was done with Angus, and I proceeded to write 5 more novels without Angus. And it was only because of people asking me at every speaking event I've been to, regardless of the novel I'm talking about. It'll go something like this in the Q&A period. I really like this novel. It was great. Thank you for talking about it. But Angus was my favorite. We're going to get another Angus novel. And that happens, 13 years after The Best Laid Plans came out. That happens. And it's not always what a writer wants to hear, that they peaked on their first novel and have been on a slow and steady decline since. But really, I'm so grateful that Angus has seemed to have struck a chord or made a connection with so many Canadians. So I said, why am I fighting it? And I decided to try another one. So we'll see. I honestly don't know if there will be another one. I don't know. I guess it'll depend on how this one is received. But
We really
I
liked the
suppose
first one. We really liked the first
yeah,
one, Terry.
exactly.
To take you back to the first one, just lastly, I found on your, by going back in time in your blog, the return to McMaster in 2007, where it says, last Wednesday, I traveled to McMaster University, where the campus bookstore hosted my first book launch and signing. Mark Lefebvre organized the event. They used a Facebook event page to advertise it. It's been nearly 25 years since I left Mac, so I wasn't expecting much of a turnout. My good friends Stefania and Jack were stalwart supporters. Steph introduced me with kind words. They stayed with me for 2 hours of the signing keeping company. They bought about a dozen books for Christmas. Over the course of the signing and in the following days, about 20 books were sold. With no previous experience as a comparison, I've decided to be very pleased with the outcome. Now, if they bought a dozen books and 20 were sold altogether, we're saying that 8 plus those 2 friends were, I mean, I completely understand the thrill of that back in 2007, but is it
Yeah.
strange to think that that was Terry Fallis? I mean, at that point, that idea of like, I sold 20.
Yeah, well, and at the time, The Big Plans was a self-published novel, and it was the Leacock Medal had not happened.
Of course.
So it really was early days, and I was thrilled just to see my book in a bookstore. And yeah, I often tell that story that it was a great event. Both people who came really enjoyed it. But my very first signing, and to sit there at a table, I wore a suit and tie. And I didn't know what writers wore to such things. And I can tell you after the last 13 years that they don't wear suits and ties generally. So I didn't know what I was doing. I was just kind of feeling my way through it. But I was so thrilled to have an event in a bookstore. It was, I'll never forget that feeling. I tell that story often.
There's about 3 minutes left here, and I just wondered if you wanted to go out with reading the beginning of the book.
Oh, we could do that. Sure. I'll just read from the top, Alan, because you don't want to give too much away.
Don't
in
want
a
to give
spy
too much
story.
away. Yeah.
All right. So let's start. So this is right from chapter 1. An MI6 agent has asked me to meet her in an hour at a pub around the corner, I blurted out. And what, man? Angus asked. You're seeking advice on what to wear or who should pay? He stood in the doorway, decked out in pajama bottoms and a white t-shirt that proclaimed, "Hovercraft lovers do it on air." By the look of him, he'd been sound asleep when I knocked. Mind you, whether in the House of Commons or his boathouse workshop, day or night, his long hair and beard almost always looked as if he'd just driven through a hurricane in a convertible. Well, I don't really know. I guess I just wanted to tell somebody that I'm meeting a secret agent in a London pub late at night for a clandestine meeting. Well, Daniel lad, by my reckoning, if you're saying that out loud in a hotel corridor, you haven't quite grasped the fundamentals of the spy game. Did she actually use the words clandestine meeting? Well, no, I guess I'm just projecting, given the circumstances and all. Well, you'd better come in. I'm bleeding awake now anyway. And this hallway is not the venue for a conversation about MI6. Oh, sorry, Angus, it's still early. I figured you wouldn't quite be asleep yet. After the day we had, I'm knackered. Nothing is quite so enervating as an interminable and mind-numbing meeting where people talk too much but say too little. All right then, lad, from the top, Angus said as he collapsed back on his bed. Well, 10 minutes ago, which would have been at 2050, I began in my most authoritative voice, but stopped when Angus lifted one eyebrow so high it threatened to break free from his forehead. What? I asked. 2050? Have you joined the military? I'm just trying to bring some clarity to the story's details and avoid any confusion. It just sounds a tad pretentious, and I fear it would soon be annoying. Annoying? I don't know why. I've only been doing it since 2100, I said, checking my watch. Besides, I'm really just trying to get into the spirit of the evening. They always use the 24-hour clock in spy novels. James Bond never arrives 12 hours late for a secret rendezvous because MI6 uses the 24-hour clock. Oh, sorry, lad, did you say something? I must have drifted back to sleep there. Now, can you move the sheep into the shearing pen with a wee bit more alacrity? Of course, but I don't know why we have to bring sheep into this. Anyway, the text came in to my personal cell phone, not my government issued mobile. So the message was clean, off the grid and off the books. Who are you spouting now, Tom Clancy or that Ludlam lad? Suffering, Daniel, get to the point. Okay, so here's her text, and I read it. I was in the briefing with you today, the no longer young woman seated on the far side of the room from you and saying nothing. I'm MI6. Please meet me at 2200 at the Copper Cup Pub, back corner table, dark blue dress. It's important, strictly confidential, and very unofficial. While frightfully cliche, tell no one and do come alone. Well, I didn't know how we're going to find you a dark blue dress to wear in the next hour, Angus said. I think that's what she's going to be wearing. Ye gods, Daniel, can you not tell when I'm having you on? Right. Sorry, I said. I'm a little nervous and maybe a little excited. So where is this Copper Cup? I've not heard of it. I Googled it, I explained. It's just around the corner from here. She must know where we're staying. Daniel, she's MI6. She probably knows what you had for breakfast and the brand of underwear you favor, Angus said. And one thing's certain, you'll not be going on your own, a lamb to the slaughter. I'll be your wingman. I replied to her text, agreeing to meet her. Then Angus and I cooked up a plan, or at least the pale imitation of something that approached the semblance of a hazy plan. And why don't I stop there? So that's just before things get interesting.
I'm clapping for the 130, 40, 50 people in the audience right now. Listen, Terry, thank you so much for being taking us into the world of Angus again. I speak for all the fans when we appreciate you, even if you want to keep moving on and doing other characters, which we will accept. We appreciate you bringing the universe back to us again and again. It is published by McClelland and Stewart, ladies and gentlemen. This is what the book looks like if you are trying to find it out there, except not backwards. And you can pick that up now. I want to mention also the next Ottawa International Writers Festival event takes place on Monday, September 13th. Julie Lalonde, the most excellent, if you just follow Julie on Twitter alone for her thoughts is worth doing, but we'll be in conversation with Ashley Bristow about her new memoir, My Own Blood. And to register for Ashley Bristow's My Own Blood, you go to the Ottawa Library website. You'll be able to find a link that's with Ashley's name on it. You'll be able to click on there. Listen, thank you to everybody for turning out tonight, and to the library and Writers Festival for hosting tonight, and to Terry Fellis for being part of this and answering questions and having a fun discussion with me. I really appreciate this, Terry, you being part of it.
Thank you, Alan. And really, thank you, Sean Wilson and the Ottawa International Writers Festival, and Courtney and her team at the Ottawa Public Library. Thank you so much. They've always been so good to me, and I'm grateful. So it was great to chat with you, Alan. It was just like the only two people in the room. So well done.
Well, thank you. And now you'll go back and read all those books behind you, and I will
That's right.
play with all these computers that are
Exactly.
That's what I do. Never going home. All right. Thanks, everybody.